Hi everyone, this lesson is to teach you trig applications. So the first thing I'd like you to do is to try to answer the do now question. State the amplitude, frequency, period, midline, and range of the following three functions. So pause the video and try to answer those questions. Now I'm going to go over the answer to each of the do now questions. If you look at question number 1 and you're looking to find the amplitude, you want to look at the number in front of the trig function. But just remember, it's the absolute value of that number. So the amplitude for question number 1 should be 4. The next thing you were asked to find is the frequency. Sometimes we call the frequency the b value. So the frequency in this function, which I'm going to notate as b, I'll label it as b over here, is 3. You always want to remember that first the coefficient of the x has to be a 1, which in this case it is, in order to find the frequency. To find the period is 2 pi divided by the frequency, or 2 pi divided by b. So that would be 2 pi divided by 3. The next thing that you would want to find is the midline. So to find the midline, you want to know if any number was added or subtracted to your function. So if I look over here, the number that was added is 3, so the equation of my midline is going to be y equals 3. That means my function was shifted vertically up 3. Lastly, I want to find my range. So to think about the range, the first thing I'm going to look at is the amplitude. Now, I found earlier that the amplitude was 4. So if there was no vertical shift to my function, I would think that my range would be from -4 to 4. But my function was shifted up 3. So that means I have to add 3 to my minimum and add 3 to my maximum. So the range value is really going to be -1 to 7. That's my range. Let's take a look at the answers to 2 and 3. So for question number 2, the amplitude should be 2. Your b value or your frequency should be a 2. The period is 2 pi divided by the frequency. Let me just zoom in a little bit. I'm learning how to use this new Apple Pen, so bear with me. This is actually my first video. So the period is 2 pi divided by your frequency, or 2 pi divided by b. So 2 pi divided by 2 would give me a period of pi. Then I want to know what the midline is. So my midline is the number that's added or subtracted, so that would be y equals -2. And lastly, I want to know the range. So to find the range, I'm going to look at the amplitude, and that's a 2. So normally my function would have a minimum of -2 and a maximum of +2, but because my function was shifted vertically down 2, I'm going to subtract 2 from each of those values, making my range -4 to 0. Okay, let's take a look at question number 3. So for question number 3, my a value or my amplitude should be a 1/2. My b value or my frequency should be a 1. My period is 2 pi divided by the frequency, or 2 pi divided by b, so it's just going to be 2 pi. The midline should be y equals 2. Then I want to find the range. So if I just thought about my amplitude being a 1/2, my range would have been -1/2 to +1/2, but my function was shifted up 2. So I need to add 2 to the minimum and add 2 to the maximum. So that would give me 1.5, or I could write 3 over 2, and that would be the minimum. And the maximum will be 2.5, or I could write that as 5 over 2. Okay, so now we're going to talk about writing the equations of trig functions in general form. So what that means is that if you're looking at your function, the coefficient in front of the x always needs to be a 1. So you can see here the b value, the frequency value, if it wasn't originally a 1, needs to be factored out. So if I looked at equation number 1, I can see that the coefficient of the x is not a 1. So because the coefficient of the x is not a 1, that means I need to factor out that value in front of the x. So I need to factor out that 2. So I'm going to rewrite my equation as y equals sine 2 parenthesis x plus something. Now I have to figure out what that something is going to be to make my equation equivalent. So if I factored out the 2, what that really means is that I'm going to divide each of the inside pieces. Let me just erase my arrow here so I have a little more space. I'm going to divide each of my inside pieces by 2. So I'm going to divide the 2x by 2, and I'm going to divide the pi by 2. So inside my parentheses, I should have x plus pi over 2. So that's telling me really that my function moved pi over 2 to the left. So you can't see your horizontal shift unless you make sure that the coefficient of the x is a 1. So if you originally looked at this function and you thought the function shifted pi units to the left, you would have been incorrect. Let's take a look at number 2. So in number 2, the coefficient of the x is a 4. So I need to make sure that I'm factoring that 4 out. So I'm going to rewrite this as y equals 3 sine 4 parentheses something. So to figure out what goes in the parentheses, I'm going to divide each of my terms by what I factored out. So I should have x minus, now you might want to think of this part instead of division as multiplication of the reciprocal. So really I have pi over 2 divided by 4. That's the same as saying pi over 2 times 1/4. So I'm going to multiply across the top and multiply across the bottom. So I would end up with pi over 8. So that's telling me that my function shifted pi over 8 units right. Okay, so let's take a look at question number 3. They want you to state the period of the following equation. So the first thing that you have to remember is the formula for period is 2 pi divided by the frequency, and we usually notate frequency with the letter B. So in this case, if you look at example 3, 2 pi divided by the frequency might look a little odd to you here because it's in terms of pi. So we need to simplify it a little bit. So again, you want to think of division as multiplication of the reciprocal. So I have 2 pi, if I wrote it sideways, divided by pi over 2. That's really equivalent to 2 pi times 2 over pi. I'm just going to put this 2 pi over 1 so I can make it into a fraction. And I'm going to multiply across the top and across the bottom. So if I multiplied across the top, I would have 4 pi. And I multiplied across the bottom, I would have pi, and then I can simplify the pi's, and I would get that my period is a 4. So as a general rule, if your frequency has a pi in it, your period will not, and vice versa. So let's try number 4. So again, I want to find the period, so it's 2 pi divided by the frequency. So I have to locate the frequency, which is the coefficient of the x term here, so it's pi over 6. Then I'm going to write this out sideways. This is really 2 pi divided by pi over 6. And I'm going to change it to multiplication of the reciprocal. Then I'll multiply across the top, and I would get 12 pi. And multiply across the bottom, I would get pi. So I end up getting 12. If you look at question number 5, you'll notice right away that your x-axis is labeled using t or time. So for the real world questions, it makes more sense to label the x-axis using time units. So I want to take a look at this question and I want to write the equation. So there are a few things I need to find. first thing I need to find is the amplitude. So when I'm looking at this function, I see the lowest the function goes is -6, y value of -6, and the highest is a y value of 6. So if I want to find the midline, I would average those two numbers. So 6 plus -6 divided by 2. So that would be 0 divided by 2, which is 0. So the equation of the midline is y equals 0. So that means my function hasn't been shifted up or down at all. If I want to draw my midline in, I can. Here is my midline, and it's y equals 0. So now I can find my amplitude. That's from the midline up or the midline down. So if my midline is y equals 0, if I were to look up here, my amplitude would be a 6. So my A value so far is a 6. Now I want to find my B value, my frequency. And this is the tricky part because my x-axis isn't labeled in terms of pi. So I can't take a look at it and see how many cycles I see between 0 and 2 pi. But I do know that frequency and period are related. So if I can find the period, then I can work backwards and find the frequency. So the formula for period is 2 pi divided by the frequency. And I know if I look at this function that I could find the period. The period is how long it takes to go through one complete cycle. So the period would be 3. So if I know the period is 3 and I know the formula for period is 2 pi divided by the frequency, now I can cross multiply to solve for it. So I'm just going to make this a little bit bigger so I have more space. So I'm going to say 2 pi equals 3b, and then I can solve for b. So my b value would be 2 pi over 3. So now I want to write my equation. So I have to remember that this is the cosine curve because cosine does not start at the midline. I also know it's positive cosine because cosine starts at its maximum value. So my equation is y equals 6 cosine 2 pi over 3 t. And I'm using t for my x value because my x-axis here was labeled using a t. Let's take a look at question number 6. So I want to find the equation for this wave. So again, I'm going to start first by finding the midline. So my minimum value is -4 and my maximum value is 4. So if I average them together, 4 plus -4 divided by 2, I would get 0 divided by 2. So again, the equation of my midline is y equals 0. So I know there was no vertical shift. And I want to find the amplitude next. So I'm going to go from my midline to the max. That would be an amplitude of 4. Next, I want to find the frequency, but again, I'm going to run into a problem just like I did in number 5. When I look at the x-axis, it's labeled in terms of time. So I'm going to need to work backwards and use the period formula. So I know that the period formula is 2 pi divided by the frequency, or 2 pi divided by b. So now I have to look and see what the period is, or how long it takes to go through a complete cycle. So let's see. So this is the cosine curve. It's actually a negative cosine curve because it started at the minimum. So it took 24, either seconds or in this case it's hours, 24 hours to go through one complete cycle. So now I'm going to say, okay, I know the period is, I know the period is 24. So 24 equals 2 pi divided by b. So now I can cross multiply to solve. So 2 pi equals 24b. And now when I divide by the 24, I would get b equals pi over 12 if I simplified that. So now I'm going to go back. Sorry, bear with me a little bit, guys. Like I said, I'm still learning how to do this, so my pen is a little thick here. Let's make it a little thinner. Okay. So my b value is pi divided by 12. So now I can write my equation. So I'm going to say, okay, y equals, now I need to think about is it sine or cosine. So it does not start at the midline, so it's cosine. However, cosine normally, if it were positive, would start at the max. In this case, our function is starting at the min, so it's going to be negative cosine. So negative, my amplitude, which was a 4, cosine, my frequency, which is pi over 12, t, because there was no vertical shift. Now, you know what? I'm also going to label my y value with a capital T, because when I look at the axes here on the y-axis, it says temperature deviation. So that would just be a little bit more precise. If you used y equals, that would have been fine too. Okay, so I'm going to look at number 7. Last question. So we want to find the equation of the household current modeled by the graph. So again, I'm going to start with the midline. So the equation of the midline, I'm going to say, okay, well, the min is negative 30 and the max is 30. So if I average that together, just like I did in the other ones, I would get y equals 0. So I'm going to draw my midline in, y equals 0, so there's no vertical shift. Now I want to find my amplitude. So from the midline up or the midline down is going to be 30. So my A value is 30. Need to find my frequency, so I'm going to use the period formula, which is 2 pi divided by b. So I have to find the period of this function. So remember, sine starts at the midline, goes to the max, goes to the midline, min, and back to the midline. So 1 over 25, that is the period. That's how long it takes to go through one complete cycle. So 1 over 25 equals 2 pi divided by b, and then I'm going to cross multiply to solve. So b equals 50 pi. So my frequency is 50 pi. So now I can write my equation. I know it's a sine curve because it starts here at the midline, and it's a positive sine curve because it goes from the midline to the max. So y equals positive 30 sine 50 pi t. And you know what? I'm going to go back again just like I did on the other one. Instead of writing y equals here, a better equation would be I equals, because if I look at the y-axis, it's labeled current I. So I'm going to say I equals 30 sine 50 pi t.